Good evening. I'm Michael Kessler, the Executive Director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and a professor in the Government Department and the Law Center. On behalf of my colleagues at the Berkley Center, it's my really great pleasure to welcome you to this timely event about Jerome Copulsky's new and compelling book, American Heretics, Religious Adversaries of Liberal Order. In the book, Jerome offers a wide-ranging historical picture of Christian theocracy and its opposition to American liberalism, from the American Revolution to the present. The book has been widely and very well reviewed from across the political spectrum, including by notable scholars like the historian Mark Knoll and the law and religion scholar Andrew Koppelman. And I'll add, even a fairly positive review in the pages of First Things. Having known Jerome for many decades, he is enough of an enigma in his own right to be the perfect interpreter of these enigmatic Americans who pushed against the grain of the liberal republic, claiming a different configuration of God, country, and fellow human. This contrarian political theology refused pieties about pluralism and secular order and celebrated a perhaps nostalgic, perhaps aspirational unanimity of Christian order, even while each example Copulsky studies betrays itself as being evidence of instead a winding, wild permutation that religious movements often undergo in reacting to and adapting to the times. One thing that unites the reviewers is that Copulsky is telling us a story that is super important and in some critical ways to understanding our own time, when these very forces of various Christians grappling for political power, sometimes succeeding in getting political power, are once again asserting their voices and views. Let me introduce my friends. Jerome Copulsky is, among other things, a Berkley Center Research Fellow with expertise in modern Western religious thought, political theory, and church-state issues. He co-directed on civil religion January 6, 2021, a digital resource created through a collaboration of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, and I see Peter Mansau over there, who Georgetown alum and was the principal advisor for that project, and the University of Alabama's Department of Religious Studies. From 2016 to 2017, Jerome was the American Academy of Religion Luce Fellow and a senior advisor at the U.S. Department of State's Office of Religion and Global Affairs, which is currently not in existence. Besides scholarly work that has appeared in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, the Journal of Religion, Political Theology, and Perspectives on Political Science, his creative writing has also appeared in The Atlantic, the Christian Science Monitor, the Washingtonian, Jerusalem Post. I urge you to look for the Washingtonian piece. The Jerusalem Post, the Jewish Review of Books, and Religion Dispatches. Jerome earned a BA from Wesleyan, an MFA from Columbia, and a PhD from the University of Chicago, where I got to know him well. Jerome is joined in this conversation by my colleague and friend, E.J. Dionne. E.J. is a senior research fellow at the Berkley Center, is the university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture, teaching in Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy in the Government Department, is a leading scholar and commentator on religion and U.S. politics. He also serves as the W. Averill Harriman Chair and Senior Fellow in Governance Studies program at Brookings Institution. And he writes a column for the Washington Post that is syndicated in over 200 outlets nationally. He has many books, and they're all significant studies of the American political scene, and to my delight, often and usually deep studies of political theology, which is dear to my heart. So with that, please welcome Jerome and E.J.
It's a real honor to be here, an honor to do anything with Michael, who lives in my neighborhood. And if you haven't seen her, his wonderful daughter is here. And one of the favorite paintings I ever bought was painted by his daughter and sold at a neighborhood art event. And God bless the Berkley Center. I told Jerome that I would say that I hoped that we would not be smited by the Holy Spirit for having an event on heresy in Riggs Library, this sacred space. And then Jerome very quickly said, this is about heresy against the American idea and not Christianity. So the Holy Spirit will leave us alone, as will the Georgetown authorities. This is a wonderful book, I have to say. I'm not just saying it because I'm up here with Jerome or that I've known him and admired him for a long time. It's so compellingly written that there are moments when you almost want to believe some of the, in some cases, rather wacky ideas that he is writing about. And I think one of the reasons that Jerome's book has gotten, and it's also puckish at times in really nice ways, but I think one of the reasons he's gotten good reviews, even from people who may have political disagreements with him, is everybody who reads the book recognizes he is really trying to get us to understand these heretical ideas, which really are, in many cases, Christians rejecting the American idea, rejecting American liberalism, rejecting the idea of a constitution that does not mention God. It is technically a godless constitution. And it goes on through our current times dealing with post-liberalism and the new nationalism. And we're going to try to cover all that tonight. And I have a lot of questions to ask, but I'm going to try to bring everyone here in as quickly as possible, because it'll be fun to see Jerome in dialogue with you. But Jerome, congratulations. This is a great book.
Thank you so much, EJ. And thank you, Michael, for that really lovely introduction. And I feel like after that, I have nothing to say to just leave.
Yeah, right.
Mic drop. But no, I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, no, it reminds me of a great event. One of my favorite American political stories, Al Smith was giving a speech, and he was getting heckled, and he was good with hecklers. And the heckler yells, "Tell us all you know, Al, it won't take long." And Al Smith, a clever guy, snapped right back and said, "I'll tell them all we both know, and it won't take longer." And so he's going to tell you all that you want to hear.
I'm good with hecklers too, so let's yeah, I'm ready.
Yeah, I believe in heckling. But anyway, but that's not my role tonight. Why don't you talk about two things? Why did you put this in the frame of heresy? Why is the book called American Heretics? And why did these various ideas appeal to you right now as a topic for a book?
Yeah, and thank you all for being here. And I really, see so many faces from many different places. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you tonight. And thank you, EJ, for agreeing to chat with me about it. So I think the impetus of the book, I started thinking about this book about 2017, 2018. So there was some political changes in this country that many of us are trying to understand and interpret and figure out where to go from there. And particularly, what did this mean for American religion? How was American religion implicated in this new dispensation of what was then the first Trump administration? And as I, just was trying to make sense of this, there were two books that came out around that time that got a lot of press, both in the popular press, but also we're getting a lot of interest among scholars and academics. And this was Ron Dreher's The Benedict Option, which came out, I think, in 2017, although he'd been writing about this idea for longer than that, and Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, which came out in 2018. And both of these books were deeply critical of contemporary American society, so much so they actually were written as, I guess, recognitions that their side, the religious traditional side, had lost the culture war. So this is happening after the Supreme Court ruled on the constitutionality of same-sex marriage. it seemed from their point of view that religious traditionalism was now a minority report, and there was no hope of kind of regaining the culture anytime soon. And the idea would be to have a strategic withdrawal into intentional communities to preserve their beliefs and way of life through these new dark ages. And both Dreher and Dionne argued that in a sense this decline into liberalism was the culmination of forces that were already present at the founding. It was inevitable, and it was inevitable because America was fundamentally a secular Enlightenment liberal project, right? And therefore, from their point of view, America was a Christian heresy in some sense. And in this, they were different from the religious right as we had known it from sort of the 70s and 80s and onward, which wanted to claim that America was originally meant to be a Christian project, that the founders were pious Christians, that they had set up what was to be a Christian nation, and it really wasn't until the mid-20th century, with the rise of secular humanism, with Supreme Court decisions regarding the separation of church and state, that this decline into what they saw as an un-Christian America happened, right? So the religious right tended to be restorationists. They wanted to bring America back to the way it was. But these new post-liberals, like America was never founded as a Christian nation. I thought, well, that's interesting. What could I do with that? Does this have a history? Does this have a tradition? And I started looking into places where I thought I would find kind of echoes of this religious illiberalism in American history. And that was, I think, the impetus of the project. And that's what led me to people like Church of England loyalists and Covenanters, the Christian Amendment movement, and so on.
It's really fun to read the history of the revolution through the eyes of Church of England loyalists, which is the only book you'll probably read that does that so well. We were talking before, one of the things I'd really like you to dig into is this really quite deep contradiction within a certain style of conservative Christianity or the religious right, whatever we want to call it, where there are those who claim that the founders founded this as a Christian nation and were aware they were doing that. And some of the best evidence against them is in this book from another group of Christian conservatives who actually say what liberals have often said, which is they were deeply influenced by the Enlightenment. Many of them were deists. Thomas Jefferson, who knows what he believed, and all that kind of stuff from that side of the argument. Talk about this odd interaction. And these are Christians, they're conservative Christians, and yet they completely contradict each other in the understanding of the Constitution and the founding.
Right, so if you look at maybe the classic manifesto of the new religious right from the late 70s and 80s was Jerry Falwell's Listen America. I think it comes out in 1980. And it really is the kind of classic presentation of the moral majority and the groups that really end up forming part of the Reagan coalition. And Falwell makes the argument that, as I described earlier, that America was originally established to be a Christian nation. And the piece of evidence he goes to, he says, as it says in our Constitution, all men are created equal and endowed with by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Now, if you know anything about the Constitution, the Constitution doesn't say that, right? That's from the Declaration of Independence. So first, it's interesting that in this classic text, Falwell makes a schoolboy's error, like this basic civics error, and it's never corrected, actually, in later editions, as I've seen. But what he's doing there is actually interesting because if you go to the Constitution, there's no mention of God, right? Unlike the Declaration of Independence with 4 references to the deity, to be sure they're not direct references to the Christian religion, Constitution has no direct mention of God except in the signature page where it says in the year of our Lord, Right? That's it. But there are places where the Constitution does deal with religion, particularly Article 6, Section 3, which prohibits a religious test for federal office. And the First Amendment, right? The religion clauses, which forbid Congress from establishing religion or prohibiting or interfering with the free exercise thereof. So it's clear that the Constitution is interested in religion, but the Constitution does not appear to be a overtly Christian document, right? And this was seen by many Christian conservatives from the time the Constitution was first came out in Philadelphia. There was a group called the Covenanters, the Reformed Presbyterians. They look at the Constitution. They actually supported the revolution against England. They were very gung ho about that. But they see the Constitution that comes out, and they're like, there's something missing. There's no mention of God. There's no mention of Jesus as Prince of Nations. There's no mention of the Bible. There's Article 6, Section 3, which means that you can have an infidel become chief magistrate, become president. It seems to be, from their point of view, a pro-slavery document, and the Reformed Presbyterians were an abolitionist church early on. So they look at this thing, and they're like, this is not Christian. Right? This is emphatically, it may in fact be anti-Christian, and so they refuse to participate. They become conscientious objectors to the country. And if you look at their critique of the founding and you compare it to the Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson Christian nation thing, who's got a better argument, right? It seems that on the merits, the Reformed Presbyterians have a point. Now, one of the ways that the religious right gets out of this is they'll try to point out all the religious, pious expressions of the founders, right? If they don't have a good quote, they'll make one up, right? But it's clear that the Constitution is not as explicitly religious as certain kinds of American Christian conservatives would want it to be. And therefore, this raises the question of the heresies that we're looking at.
Jerome quotes a line attributed to Hamilton. I don't know if we know it, but know if it's true. But it is said that someone said to Hamilton, "God isn't in there," and he said, "Yeah, we forgot." I think it was almost exactly those words. This idea of Christianizing the Constitution explicitly has come up again and again. You talk about the 1880s, 1890s, but then also. And I forgot, I never knew, Senator Flanders of Vermont in the 1950s trying to insert an amendment to the Constitution that explicitly would correct the flaw that those Reformed Presbyterians saw. Talk about how those movements have come up at various points in our history.
Yeah, so the Reformed Presbyterians, as I mentioned, were conscientious objectors to essentially the country, and they wouldn't vote, they wouldn't stand for office, they wouldn't serve on juries, they tried to stay out of the militia, they paid their taxes, but they felt that they didn't really have a choice in paying their taxes. But they wanted America to be a Christian nation, so they prayed for America, they wrote a lot of stuff, but they wouldn't do anything, even though they recognized that there was an amendment process that could solve this problem, but they couldn't actively participate in this amendment process because that would mean working within a nation that they felt was infidel, until the Civil War, right? And then things change. And the first thing I should mention with this is that when the Confederate states came together to create their new Constitution in 1861, they acknowledged God in the preamble of their Constitution. They also acknowledged slavery in a much more direct way.
I was going to say the Constitution with God in it was the pro-slavery.
Was their pro-slavery, and this was celebrated by a number of the pro-slavery theologians of the South. Although the leading pro-slavery theologian, a guy named James Henley Thornwell, felt it didn't go far enough, and he wanted the Constitution to explicitly mention Jesus as Prince of Nations and the Bible as the source of law. So he felt it was a halfway measure. But the Southerners were not the only ones who felt that somehow a a constitution needed this theological grounding. And during the Civil War, a lot of Northern ministers also came to the position that one of the causes of the war was God's displeasure, God's punishment for this faithless founding. But the sin of slavery, but also the sin of not acknowledging God. And so the Covenanters, these Reformed Presbyterians who up until this point had tried to stay out of politics, saw an opening. And they joined forces with a number of Northern ministers and their allies to put forward a constitutional amendment, essentially amending the preamble of the Constitution to set it on the right theological grounding. And they had a petition drive. They actually met with people up on the Hill, and they had an audience with Lincoln during the war. And Lincoln received them cordially, had a conversation with them, and for all we know, kind of left the paper in the drawer. But it didn't go anywhere until the issue was raised again in the 1870s after the Civil War. And here the issue was not God's displeasure because of the sin of slavery, but a worry about religious pluralism and secularism in American society. And so the Covenanters and their evangelical allies were looking at how Catholics, Jews, Mormons, and others were asserting their religious rights or their rights to not participate in religion based on the First Amendment. And the conservatives realized that essentially this was an Achilles heel for their notion of Christian America. And so in the 1870s, created a new movement called the National Reform Association, the original NRA, to petition.
I know, that kept confusing me.
To convince the nation, convince Congress to create a Christian amendment, to rewrite the amendment in order to protect a Christian nation that was now under assault. And this continues
you just take it to Flanders, because the 1950s were a fascinating period in this discussion as well. Kevin Cruz at Princeton had a very interesting book on One Nation Under God, and it's when God got inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance. He wasn't there in the original, written by a Christian socialist, as I recall. And there were other ways of getting God got on the currency in the early 1950s. Talk about that. And then the Flanders Amendment, which didn't really go anywhere, but was, except for one hearing, I believe.
One hearing over 2 days. So I have to give you one more piece of information before we go there, which is when the Christian Amendment movement, Christian Amendment people, the National Reform Association, were pushing for this amendment to protect America from Catholics and Jews and Mormons and secularists. They actually conjured up their boogeyman in the form of a guy named Francis Abbott, who was a self-avowed secularist who ran a magazine called The Index, who decided that the biggest threat to America was not secularism, but this kind of religious radicalism that was going to undercut the separation of church and state as he understood it. So he formed a group, the Liberal League, that created its own proposal for amendment, the Religious Freedom Amendment, which would take the religion clauses of the First Amendment, which at that point only pertained to Congress, and have them pertain to the states as well. So you have these two amendments in the 1870s going at the same time. Then a third amendment comes in, the Blaine Amendment, which is a kind of an anti-Catholic amendment. All these amendments are being discussed. None of them go anywhere. The issue kind of flames out for a while until the 1940s and 50s. And what happens is in the 1940s, the liberals, our Liberal League kind of gets what it wants in 1947 with the Everson decision, right? Where the Supreme Court incorporates the First Amendment by means of the 14th Amendment. So the First Amendment now pertains to the states, so the separation of church and state becomes a constitutional doctrine, and now not only can Congress make no law pertaining to establishment of religion, but you can't provide money to to sectarian schools, parochial schools. By the 1960s, prayer and Bible reading are also ruled as constitutionally illicit. And you have this kind of secularization through the courts of American public life. But at the same time, over there in the Hill, Congress is making laws to put the phrase "under God" into the Pledge of Allegiance, to put the phrase "in God we trust" on the currency, and then make it the national motto. All of this part of a kind of Cold War civil religion to demonstrate that the United States is a godly republic against atheist communism. All right, so that's what's going on. So you have this kind of political schizophrenia on the issue, and during this time, the remnants of the religious amendment people decide, well, we'll give it another shot, right? And they get some help with the National Association of Evangelicals. They get a hearing up on the Hill. Only one senator shows up. It's not very well attended. This is all happening, by the way, in May of 1954, so the same time as the Pledge of Allegiance is going through Congress, there's this hearing on a Christian amendment. So the Christian amendment people come and make their case. They are met by the opponents of the Christian amendment, which are representatives from Jewish organizations such as the American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League. And they argue that, in fact, the Christian amendment is anti-American. It goes against what the founders themselves had wanted, right? And they quote chapter and verse from American history, quoting Jefferson and Madison and Washington, what have you. Now, there's one other thing that happens that almost throws this thing off the rails, is that the word got out that there was going to be a Christian amendment hearing. A group of concerned Christian women patriots from California come to give their testimony, and they argue for the importance of a Christian amendment to protect America from not only communism, but American Judaism, which is interested in de-Christianizing Christianity. Right? So they have a whole conspiracy theory that groups like the ADL and the AJC are trying to, through their interfaith activities, take Christ out of Christianity. This embarrasses the Christian Amendment movement people. They try to proclaim that some of their best friends are Jews. One of them remarks that Harry Houdini used to spend time at his house. They're friends with Rabbi. It's true. I mean, this is all in the transcript. You can go and I don't make up quotes, right? That's the difference between, but it's all there. But it I think showed that on the one hand, I think the Christian Amendment people were very sincere. They were essentially making the same argument that that a nation has certain responsibilities to the Creator, and these responsibilities were not being expressed in the Constitution as it was written in Philadelphia. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who were aligned with this movement who saw it doing something else, essentially creating different classes of citizens within the country.
So I want to get to the audience, but there are three issues that I want to cover before I do that. The first is we are at Georgetown, a great Jesuit and Catholic institution, and you really do justice to John Courtney Murray in this book. And John Courtney Murray is the opposite, actually, of a heretic. He is a believer within certain framework in the American idea. Talk about John Courtney Murray and how you decided to include him in this account. And I just found it very interesting.
Yeah, so John Courtney Murray is possibly the leading Catholic political theologian in America in the mid-century.
By the way, the new Archbishop wrote a thesis and a book about John Courtney Murray, Archbishop McElroy.
And he publishes a book in the fall of 1960 called "Behold These Truths." And what Murray was trying to do was he's looking at mid-century America and he's seeing how American Catholics have kind of made it, right, into the mainstream of American society. But there's still this lingering anti-Catholic prejudice. That there's some tension between Catholic faith and the American project and the American Republic. And this tension goes all the way back even before the American Revolution, right? Its roots are in arguments about the Protestant Reformation. It's in arguments about the Quebec Act. in 19th century nativism. But the fear was that the Catholic tradition had never accepted the American Republican lowercase r project, right, of popular sovereignty, of the separation of church and state. That Catholics in America, the Catholics believe that, well, the separation of church and state, this religious freedom was fine so long as Catholics were in the minority. But the thesis, the real way in which the church and state ought to be organized would be a confessional state, where the state has certain responsibilities to protect the true church, the Roman Catholic Church, and other traditions may be tolerated but do not have the full public religious liberty. So there was a fear among Protestant theologians and others and secularists that Catholics were really, they were supporting America, but kind of with their fingers crossed, right? Because they had never come out to explicitly endorse the American project as being kosher, right? And what Courtney, and so there's this lingering anti-Catholic animus, right? Paul Blanchard's book was a good example of this. And Murray decided to take it upon himself to essentially say, well, this is a problem that the Catholic Church in America hasn't addressed, but it's partially a problem because Catholics haven't really understood their own teachings on political theology, on the relationship of religion, the relationship of civil authority. Right? They kind of got stuck in this 19th century moment of the papacy in its war with the French Revolution, and hadn't understood that the American project, rightly understood, is rooted in and is a flowering of a deeper Christian political tradition. And that if you go and you reread the Declaration of Independence, you can see how this is a flower. It's not a break from Christendom, but it is a Christian politics in a different key. So he set out to work to do this excavation in the 1950s, and he got some pushback from the church authorities here in the United States. But by the 1960s, the Vatican was beginning to be more friendly, more towards this kind of activity. He publishes this book, and of course, the fall of 1960 is a really important time for American Catholics, right? JFK. And JFK famously had to deal with this question publicly. He goes to Houston to meet with the Houston's Ministerial Association to tell them he will not be an agent of the Pope, right? That he believes in the separation of church and state. That's the America he believes in. So the book comes out, and it's really this expression of a kind of Catholic Americanism. So much so that Murray says, the American tradition is based on the teaching of natural law. Natural law is accessible to all rational human beings. So it's not only Catholics, Protestants, Jews, others have access to natural law. But by the 1960s, it's really only the Catholics who are teaching it in their schools and in their universities. And as natural law, the teaching of natural law withers away, this foundation of the American project becomes weaker. Right? We kind of forget what we're based on. And so if America is going to continue for Murray, it will be the American Catholics who will be the custodians of this American political tradition. This is how I read this argument. Now, I use him because I actually don't think he's an American heretic. I think he's an Americanist. He's trying to read the American tradition in Catholic terms. But I use him as a foil to another group of Catholic conservatives who I have to thank EJ for helping me understand.
Oh, we should talk about that. But is it Murray or one of his critics who said Thomas Aquinas was the first Whig?
That was Murray.
That was Murray. Yeah. So take that home with you. It sounds like a good T-shirt for a theological seminary. So I think I am the only person in this room who subscribed to a magazine called Triumph back in the 1960s, 70s, late 60s.
It comes out, starts in 66, I think.
Yeah. Which I was a lover, I've always been a lover of opinion magazines. And this is in its way an offshoot from National Review, founded by Brent Bozell. And it's a fascinating story, which you tell really well here. And we once had lunch over Triumph Magazine and Brent Bozell. So tell this story.
Yeah, one of the joys of writing this book was I'd come up on something and I'd be like, I need to know more information about it. And I'd phone a friend. And I'm like, EJ, have you heard of Triumph Magazine? It's like, have I heard about them? I subscribe to them. And I'm like, they were so. Trying to find the Catholic story here, and I come across in my reading the story of L. Brent Bozell Jr. and his magazine. Now, L. Brent Bozell Jr. Went to Yale in the late 40s, early 50s. He was friends with and the debating partner of William F. Buckley Jr., founder of National Review. And he and Buckley were really the sort of the wunderkind of the emerging American conservative movement in the mid-1950s. They worked together to do a book supporting Joseph McCarthy. Buckley formed the National Review. Bozell was the ghostwriter for Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative.
There's a great line that I never saw before that an advisor to Goldwater said that it was Goldwaterism with 200-proof Bozell mixed in.
Yeah. I mean, Bozell's a really talented writer, really, really fascinating guy. So he's writing this book. It's the late 50s, early 60s. He'd gone to Yale Law School. He didn't want to be a lawyer. He was a writer. He's writing a book on the Warren Court, why the Warren Court was bad. And he's trying to put this together. And his brother-in-law says, hey, I got an idea for you. You want to live cheap and drink good wine? He had a burgeoning family, so he was trying to be budget conscious. Buckley says, go to Spain and do it. So Bozell goes to Spain early 1960s, and while he's there, he, as it happens, he falls in love.
This is Franco's Spain, bear in mind.
And he falls in love with Franco's Spain. That's what he falls in love with. Not necessarily with the dictator himself, but with this public Catholicism, with this Catholic thing, like that Spain, in his view, is this remnant of medieval Christendom. He loves it. He feels at home, and he comes back, and he becomes increasingly irritated and alienated from what's going on in the American conservative movement with his brother-in-law. He looks at this fusion idea, the idea that religious traditionalism and libertarian individualism can kind of work together in a productive tension. This is being theorized by Frank Meyer, and this is being stage managed at the National Review by Buckley. He's like, this is really just a fig leaf for liberalism, right-wing liberalism. And so in 1966, he decides to break and form his own magazine called Triumph. And he brings together a number of conservative Catholic intellectuals to write for him, and it really becomes a radical Catholic alternative to the American project. So they start writing articles that are the American founding was a liberal Enlightenment secular founding, and that's why it's bad, and that's why the country's going to hell. Right? He's writing in the context of Vietnam and the student protests, the rise of the Black Power movement, the emergence of abortion politics. They look at all this, and this is all for them signs of the times. And the answer is not American conservatism, because American conservatism, as I just suggested, is just right-wing liberalism. The answer is a new Christendom that will rise from the ashes of this burning culture, as he sees it. Now, from this, you can see why Murray is an interesting foil, because for them, Murray is an example of a Catholic who's capitulated to American liberalism. Right? Murray is not the answer to the problem of America and Catholicism. Murray is a symptom of so many attempts to give up one's true vision of a Christian society for participation in the American project. So there are many articles throughout the magazine attacking Murray as this false prophet of American order.
It's a great chapter, and there was a famous when Pope John the 23rd came out with his very progressive encyclical Mater et Magistra, the National Review didn't like it, and somebody quipped it quipped in the magazine, Mater si, Magistra no. And then Jerome couldn't resist as he's writing about this controversy between Triumph and Murray, and he said their position was Mater si, Murray no. So let's go finally to now. And the rise of the work of our former Georgetown colleague Patrick Dionne and Professor Vermeule up at Harvard Law School. And sort of this relates now to nationalism, a bit to Christian nationalism, but the anti-liberal project now. And how does that project draw on everything you have written up to that point in the book? And how is it quite different in certain ways from that project?
Yeah, and I think the first point I'd make when we look at people like Dionne and Vermeule, and I also read about Yoram Hazony, is that this isn't new, right? This anti-liberalism, this religious anti-liberalism, has this long and deep and interesting tradition in America, history in America, and it doesn't just come out of nowhere. I mean, if you read Patrick Dionne's Why Liberalism Failed, after you read a lot of Zeal, you're like, okay, I saw this in 1967. So it's not new. What is new, I think, is, I mentioned at the outset how when I started this book and I looked at people like Dionne and Roger, they began with a position of we've lost, right? So all we can do is withdraw, self-preservation until, essentially to build an ark to wait out the flood. But fairly soon they pivot and they realize, well, maybe there's this new political dispensation that we can reorient ourselves in, right? Maybe the Trump administration is more friendly and will to the kinds of projects that we care about. Maybe the answer is not withdrawing, but go marching forward. We saw this in Vermeule wrote a very interesting and influential response review to Dionne's book, Why Liberalism Failed. He called it Integration from Within. So Vermeule, the law professor, he's a specialist in administrative law, said, well, what we really need to do is not withdraw to our little intentional communities, but get our people into the bureaucracy, right? And then we can kind of nudge the society in certain ways. Patrick Dionne's follow-up book was called Regime Change, where he argued for a rethinking of what the American political order might look like. So all these projects, we could talk about the National Conservatives. We could, in a different valence, we can talk about the people associated with the New Apostolic Reformation. I talk about a little in the book, but it goes a little bit beyond my competency.
Am I correct? Mike Johnson is involved with them, or is he with another group?
Yeah.
Like them?
So they're kind of the New Apostolic Reformation. These networks, these international networks of charismatic Pentecostalist Christians, which were really the leading edge of phenomena like the Jericho March during the Stop the Steal. A lot of people who were involved in the January 6th riot, many were associated with this movement. Paula White, a lot of the people who were seeing politics or articulating American politics in terms of spiritual warfare, right? That's where they're coming from. Now, I don't think they have as sophisticated a theological political position as the people I've been working on throughout the book, but they also articulate this anti-liberal form of Christian supremacism. There's a wonderful book. The place to go on this topic is a book by Matt Taylor called The Violent Take It by Force. Came out, I think, also back in October, which I highly recommend.
Thank you. So let's go to this learned audience. The gentleman, and let's see, we have a mic going around. So the gentleman over there who's got the same hair color as I do, bless you. And then, what? I'm sorry? Antique blonde. Yeah, I like that.
Hi, Jerome. Thank you very much for your book. I'd like to ask if you could take us back to Madison. As a student of Witherspoon, out of a Presbyterian tradition at Princeton, who then brings about the First Amendment on the separation of church and state. How does Madison get there, and why does he get there? What are the issues of the state of religion in the colonies at the time that go back to some of the bases you said earlier that we've forgotten?
That's a great question, and the short answer is I talk a little bit about that in chapter 1, but Madison, and the shorter answer is Jefferson got to him. To step back, if you look at the religious situation at the time of the American Revolution, you had this patchwork of establishments and non-establishments, right? So famously, in New England, there was a kind of Congregationalist establishment, sort of the continuation of the old Puritan New England. In the southern colonies, so in Virginia, Maryland, on down the Carolinas and Georgia, you had a Church of England establishment, kind of the what the Church of England wanted to have across its empire was somewhat, not completely, but somewhat established there. And by establishment, I mean that they got money and from the government through taxation. They were the official church. Dissenters would be tolerated, but they didn't have full religious rights in these situations.
By the way, one of the fascinating things I learned from your book, which I did not know, is, correct me if I'm remembering wrong, Anglicanism, the Church of England was established in the counties that are now New York City, but not in the rest of the state of New York. How did that happen? But anyway, answer this question.
You have this if you go to the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, you have this kind of non-establishment, you have this little kind of quasi-establishment of the Church of England in those 4 counties in New York. But essentially you have this remarkable religious diversity, Quakers in Pennsylvania, but also Lutherans and Mennonites and Presbyterians and Catholics and Jews. It was really a great deal of religious pluralism, so any kind of establishment wouldn't work. By the time the revolution comes, there's really a push towards disestablishment. Obviously, you would no longer have a Church of England in the United States of America. So there's a rebranding that happens into the Protestant Episcopal Church. But they get quickly, those churches are quickly disestablished during the American Revolution. There was a push by Patrick Henry to have it would be a kind of a general establishment. Essentially, the government would collect taxes and pay them out to churches and to ministers. It was a general assessment. So it kind of was not really establishment, but a kind of financial connection between the government of Virginia and the church. And Madison and Jefferson realized that this was a really bad idea. Madison famously writes his memorial remonstrance against it. He then lobbies both Baptists and Enlightenment, we consider Enlightenment types, against this encroachment of political power on the church. And they win. And that becomes essentially what later the foundation for the First Amendment of the Constitution. Now, for Madison, the reason was that he didn't want the government to have any influence over people's rights of conscience. For him, this was an ideological or doctrinal issue, one might say. But also, they were recognizing it was prudent where you had religious diversity in this new nation, that to pick any one denomination was going to cause conflict. Even to get the government involved in the churches was going to cause conflict. People would be jockeying for that money, for that influence. So this notion of, wasn't Madison's term, the separation of church and state's later Jefferson's term, but this idea of there's place for civil authority, a place for religious authority, civil authority shouldn't interfere with religious authority. That becomes what I call in the book the American orthodoxy that my heretics are arguing against.
That's great. Over here, please.
Hi. Well, this has been quite interesting. Thank you so much for that. My name is Jose, and first I want to ask if you see important divisions within the current post-liberal movements. I remember a few years ago, perhaps not everyone knows this case, but there was a famous case in the 19th century in which Pope, if I remember, Pius IX kidnapped a Jewish kid, right? And this was being debated in First Things a few years ago. And I believe it was Adrian Vermeulen who said, well, the question is like, should we be debating this in public? Because he obviously had the right to kidnap this kid. And Joran Hassomi, being a proud Jewish man, he was amazingly shocked about how are you saying this? How can you defend a pope kidnapping a Jewish kid? So do you see many divisions inside the movement? And do you see also a Christian liberal pushback against them? Some Catholics who might be following the steps of Jacques Maritain or Fulton Sheen, right, who say Americanism is not a real heresy, it's not properly understood what American Republic is about.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's so much there. The First Things controversy was really interesting, and it seems this was a case where someone had written an article that was defending this famous kidnapping case where a young Jewish child was surreptitiously baptized by the nanny, and then the church kept him because they didn't want to return the child to a Jewish family to be raised as Jewish. The child actually grew up to be a priest. It became a very controversial case and not only in Italy, but I think there were people protesting this issue back here in the United States as well. And then someone in First Things published a piece kind of retroactively defending this. I think there are, if you look at post-liberals, there are many different kinds of post-liberals. I mean, what does post-liberal mean? What is we could describe what liberalism means. What was that after mean? And there are different visions, right? And in the book, I talk about this kind of Catholic integralist vision, which is trying to institute that thesis, right, of what a confessional state would look like that John Courtney Murray was arguing against. But there's also a kind of national conservative form of post-liberalism that you mentioned, Yoram Hazony, that he talks about. He wants a restoration of public religion in the United States, and for him that would be a Anglo-Protestantism, which would be the dominant religion. He is an Orthodox Jew. He lives in Jerusalem. He believes that Israel should be a Jewish state and America should be an Anglo-Protestant state where religious minorities are tolerated but do not have the full public religious liberty that the nation has afforded them historically. So I think, the question is, well, they all don't like liberalism. They don't like the liberal order. They can work together in a kind of co-belligerency until such a time when, well, one or the other becomes dominant and wants to put down their rules, and then you have this problem that liberalism emerges from to begin with of fundamental religious conflict.
Isn't there also a kind of secular quality to parts of, say, the Trump movement or this nationalist movement that there's some evidence that Trumpism was less supported for a while by the more religious style conservatives? Is that also a fissure within this national project?
It's hard to say what Trumpism is, right?
Yeah, well, that's...
And I think there's a very, what happened in 2016 is this was a bit of a surprise, and probably no one was surprised as much as the Republican Party and the conservative movement, because Donald Trump did not come out of the conservative movement. He was not movement conservative. And when he wins, and there's essentially an intellectual vacuum that occurs that people like Vermeulen and Hazony and Dionne and many others are rushed in to fill, to essentially theorize the revolution that had already happened, and to essentially guide it, right? There's a wonderful book that's coming out in a couple of months by a friend of mine, Laura Field, on this issue, which I raised to your attention right now, because she looks at the different camps that comprise the sort of the Trump intellectual movement. And you can see that they have different ideas, both of what nationalism is, what the role of religion ought to be, where the government and how the government should control or not control the economy. So these things I think are still in flux. So I don't have a good answer. One of the answers I could give on the religion question is the first people to support the candidacy of Donald Trump in 2015, 2016 were not the kind of establishment religious right. They
were mostly for Ted Cruz.
Yes, yeah. Ted Cruz, maybe support for Rubio. I think was Huckabee run in 2016?
Huckabee was earlier.
Earlier, okay. Yeah. But they were supporting other candidates. The people who were supporting Trump were people like Paula White. People who were affiliated with these charismatic networks, who are not seen as the A-list religious right. And I think that really has changed the way in which we need to think about American religion and politics, because it's no longer the heirs of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and those organizations. It's something else that's happening.
Anyone? Over here, please.
Thank you so much for this talk. It seems to me that the kind of anti-orthodoxy that we experience today has an affective element. There's a lot of zeal. There's a kind of a sense of righteousness, and I think it has a way of unifying people around a post-liberal project, so to speak. So I'm curious if that has precedent in some of the other heretics that you looked at, and kind of how that played out in those instances.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah, it's drop thing. It's interesting that most of the people that I write about were intellectuals of some sort. They were ministers, they were writers, they were politicians. They were all deeply learned. A lot of them were very skeptical of Zeal, of the kind of emotional quality that's often associated with certain aspects of American religion. And so I'm kind of answering this question negatively, but a good example of this, I spent some time with the Christian Reconstructionists and people like Roshas J. Rushdoony and Gary North, who are the architects of this very radical Calvinist argument that the civil society should be, that religious society or society as such ought to be theocratic, right? And that the divine laws that are promulgated in the Hebrew Bible are the laws that should structure American society. And they looked at American Christians, and their complaint about American Christianity was that it was too emotional, too pietistic. It wasn't interested in building a Christian society. It was interested in personal relationships or personal experiences, right? And this had kept them from the task, from the duty of building up a true Christian society. So, many of the people that I write about were not writing in that, or were not speaking in that kind of emotional level that I think your question suggests. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that they were not writing with a lot of zeal, or that they were not sort of motivated by very strong convictions. I think one of the funny stories that I tell in the book is of a sermon that was given by Jonathan Boucher in Maryland, and I think it's 1774, as tensions are ratcheting up during the American Revolutionary era. And there was, in his community, there were those who were loyalists, who were supporting the king, supporting Great Britain, and there were those who were supporting the patriot cause. And when he got to his church to deliver his sermon, he was met with a mob of anti-loyalist members. He was told that if he had gone up to give his sermon, he would be attacked. He went anyway, and he ended up getting into fisticuffs with the mob. and in order to escape the church, pulled out his pistol, held it to the head of the leader of the mob, and essentially said, if I don't get out of here, I'm going to take your head off. So there was a lot of zeal, right? It was, there was a lot of zeal.
Well, it hit me, by the way, reading that part of the book. There was a fair amount of persecution against pro-British Church of England people.
Yeah, there's this very famous story of Samuel Seabury. Have you seen the show the Hamilton musical? The one that's not coming to Washington. So if you had seen the musical, you'll know that towards the beginning there's this song by a guy named Samuel Seabury, who's then a Church of England clergyman in Westchester, and which I was very excited to see, although Lin-Manuel Miranda gets it wrong. And he gets it wrong because he has Samuel Seabury get up there in a soapbox and say, I'm Samuel Seabury, and I'm going to sing you this song. And in fact, Samuel Seabury wrote important works of loyalist propaganda, but the one that he's singing from in the show is something called Letters from a Westchester Farmer, which he's writing in the guise of a Westchester farmer, not in his name of Samuel Seabury, the clergyman, because he believed that it would get a better hearing if he was writing from the position of just a regular farmer than from a fancy clergyman. But B, he was afraid that if it published under his name, he might be harmed. And in fact, it soon got out that it was Samuel Seabury who wrote it. And he was kidnapped by the Sons of Liberty and taken to New Haven and held prisoner for a couple weeks, where they're trying to get it out that he actually wrote this, and he didn't admit it. So loyalists during the American Revolution, particularly those in New England and New York and places that were under Patriot authority, realized they could not perform their services because their services from the Book of Common Prayer required them to pray for the king. Right? And this was considered an act of treason by the new United States, and so they essentially shuttered their churches for the duration of the war. And then, of course, when they rebranded, they changed the liturgy.
Please. My old friend here is coming around here.
I hope this question is not off the mark, but among all of the history that we've just gone through and all the dissenting views, what I don't hear is the voices of commonality regarding principles of behavior that many religions agree on. So how does that factor? E.g., I know that's something that you focus on. I know the Berkley Center focuses on that. Are those voices totally overshadowed at this point, given all the contention in our system right now? And how does that fit within this profile?
Yeah. I'll give the most difficult example of this in the book, of a behavior that was not agreed upon, and that was the institution of slavery. I have a chapter on the pro-slavery theologians in the 1850s into early 1860s, and their argument was that slavery, as was being practiced in the South, was not only not immoral, but in fact was well within their understanding of the Christian tradition. Right? And they,
in fact, that those who disagreed with them didn't understand the Bible or the tradition.
Right. And that, so the abolitionists, in their view, those who were arguing that Christianity condemned slavery as sinful, they wrote that those people were heretics, that they had misunderstood the Bible and they had misunderstood the Christian tradition, right? So this was the major theological struggle of the mid-19th century, and both sides are reciting chapter and verse, right? And both sides are appealing to the Bible. The abolitionist side also appealed to American scripture. They could appeal to the Declaration of Independence. And writers such as Frederick Douglass and Albert Barnes said, look, our our founding document, the Declaration of Independence, is we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And the pro-slavery theologian said, if that's the case, the Declaration of Independence is infidel, and is part of the reason why America was poorly founded. So I think that, that's the hard case. But I think you're right that on most things, people agree within the Christian tradition, even outside the Christian tradition, right? The fundamental difference of the people that I'm writing about in this book are they look at the American project and they see it based on popular sovereignty aimed at worldly goods, right? The Constitution is aimed at a common good in the here and now, but does not orient us towards a higher good. The people that I write about believe that the government is an institute of God, that it needs to recognize that it is that civil government is of divine origin and should do things for the church and should orient its subjects towards their common good and towards their higher good. So I think that's really where the differences lie.
I must say, if I could, and then I want to bring two voices in. Reading your chapter on slavery, there are so many arguments in there that are familiar, that you hear recapitulated between, if you will, Christian progressives, Christian conservatives, that for opponents of American slavery, for whom the evil of the institution was self-evident, the scriptural defense represented a stubborn clinging to a purportedly pro-slavery letter, while overlooking its liberationist and humanitarian spirit. We can think of that happening so often, whereas the pro-slavery people said the anti-slavery people had a view based on the subjective authority of the human conscience over the unerring word of God, theologically suspect, if not downright heretical. And I was just reading that and thinking how many times arguments between competing parts of the Christian tradition are cast in those terms. Sir, and there was someone over here. Why don't we, what kind of time do we have?
15 minutes.
Oh, good. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much. Really enlightening discussion. I've not had a chance to read your book yet, so this may be an unfair question, in which case you can say next question. Since heresies have a tendency to spread, this looks like the fever is also in Europe. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about this. In other words, a much broader civilizational kind of movement that may be going on and so forth. So I don't know if it's a fair question or not, but I just wondered about your thoughts of this broader aspect to it that I see also some aspects in Europe.
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. It's a really interesting one. So I'll answer in two ways. I think on the one hand, America, the United States of America, is a special case in the fact that we have this founding moment that has a kind of founding ideology that we can talk about and point to, right? America as an idea or a collection of ideas, whereas in European countries, it's much more complicated historically, right? With that said, we're seeing the resurgence of illiberal traditions, religious traditions, and political traditions throughout Europe and throughout the world. I mentioned Yoram Hazony and the National Conservative Movement. Now, Yoram Hazony is based in Jerusalem. He founded this thing called the Edmund Burke Society. But the idea was to create and cultivate a nationalist international, so to speak, to bring together not only American national conservatives, but British national conservatives and French ones and German ones, particularly Hungarian ones, right? Polish ones, Italian ones, and to do these conferences in places like Washington, D.C., but also in London and in Brussels and in Rome and what have you. There are commonalities between European forms of illiberalism, Israeli forms of illiberalism, Indian forms of illiberalism, we might want to say Chinese form of illiberalism. What they have in common is a dislike of liberalism, liberal democracy, global institutions, multilateral institutions, institutions that get in the way of strong claims of national sovereignty and what have you. So I think that there's something bigger going on here. And if we look at Zeal, who I mentioned earlier, Zeal was deeply influenced by his time in Spain and his admiration for the Franco regime. Today's post-liberals are often very vocally admiring Hungary, right, and Viktor Orban. Not so much today, but back, maybe 10 years ago, a lot of people were expressing admiration for Putin's Russia. So there are ways in which Americans are looking to these European models of illiberalism. But I also think that it may be going the other way as well, and we'll see how that plays out. I mean, I've always thought it kind of funny that American thinkers would look to Hungary as a model. Nothing wrong. It's not because of Hungary. It's just that the Hungarian situation is so different from the American situation, right? There's just it's apples and oranges, and it doesn't looking at what Orban is trying to do and cultivate in Hungary and what we could do and cultivate here just seems weird. But people get inspiration in different places.
Could I just piggyback on that? Two things. One, it's really striking that the Conservative Political Action Conference, which has been going on for a long time, which was very much American Reaganite kind of conservatism, now has meetings abroad, meetings in Hungary. I think they had a meeting in Budapest, and bring in some of the nationalists from Europe. That's a real sign. I think that's a real shift within the American right. And I was in Denmark and was talking to a Danish historian of the United States, deeply devoted, and he said a fascinating thing. He said to him, a Dane looking at American history saw Trump as more a European-style figure than an American-style figure. And I've been conjuring that ever since he said it. There is a certain kind of truth there, I think, that goes to this internationalization that you're talking about. This gentleman over there.
Thanks so much. Good to see you, Jerome, and thank you for the book. You'd spoken about, in terms of the defenders or the progenitors of U.S. separation of church and state and liberalism, grounding in Enlightenment values, as well as desire to avoid, sort of squabbles over which variant of Christianity will be preeminent. But there's another line of defense for separation of church and state. I think about Benjamin Constant in the French context, where he talks about actually authentic, sort of advanced religious sentiment best develops when it's kept separate from politics and from the state. And I wonder, was there anybody in the U.S. context making the case for separation of church and state in those terms, in the terms that it would actually help authentic religious sentiment to develop better than it would be if there was an established church of whatever kind?
Yeah, I think you get that in Madison. I think you get that in the Memorial and Remonstrance. You mentioned Constant. I begin the book with Alexis de Tocqueville and Democracy of America. And Tocqueville has a number. Tocqueville he's a young French nobleman who comes and is visiting the United States in the late 1820s, and kind of is a tourist, but he writes his reflections. It becomes a very important volumes of book on American democracy and democracy in general. And he spends a lot of time talking about religion. He says, the thing about American religion is Americans are really religious. Much more, and Americans don't see any tension between being religious and being Americans. And the reason for that, he says, is because of the separation of church and state, because of the fact that the church isn't established, that the church, for the most part, and he's only seeing one slice of it in the 1820s, 1830s. The church is not getting involved in sort of the ins and outs of base political activity, but the church is fundamental in cultivating the democratic personality, the mores of a democratic society, and the cultivating the virtues which will hold this all together. So I think in a way, Tocqueville is seeing what you suggest Constant is saying, that by separating political authority from religious authority, the religious authority actually has more authority, and the individual's religious creativity is allowed to flourish.
We have time for one more or a couple more? Do we have, or we can take two and he'll answer them together and skip the hard one.
Yeah.
John back there and one over here. So you could do a duet, but go ahead.
John Borelli here at Georgetown. And to your point, in the late 20s, the United States was the first place where a national interfaith organization, namely Christians and Jews, came into being. The National Conference, originally called Of Jews and Christians, formed in reaction to the anti-Catholicism that was building in the campaign of Al Smith. Although Catholics could not belong as organizations, Jewish and Protestant brotherhood organizations formed it, and Catholic individuals, because Catholics were forbidden by Rome to engage in formal public events with dissenters from the Catholic faith. And so they were formed to help Al Smith, and he didn't win, but they flourished, and they sent around teams of a rabbi, a Protestant minister, and a Catholic priest, usually priests like Paulus, very much on the edge of the Catholic Church, to towns doing chautauquas, talking about civic virtues. And I think this led the way to the multi-faith chaplaincy of the war, and it was all epitomized in the 4 chaplains of the Dorchester, who became kind of the patron saints of this whole movement. And was there any reaction to this by these heretics that here were Christians and Jews working together to promote the American values and doing the very thing you were saying, religious people who could easily be American. The priest got away with it because he said, oh, we're just talking civic virtues. We're not talking religion as such. Thank you.
And hold that thought, and then the gentleman over here.
Yeah. Hey, Jerome. I guess the more things change, the more they stay the same, which is to say that the cyclical nature of the universe is alive and well. But just to tie things back to today, and every group wants the larger group to mold to what they would prefer, which we see today too. So what do you think was the guiding hand then from the framers who were writing the Constitution to keep them, I guess it was amongst themselves, they came from different backgrounds. Maryland's were Catholic, and people in Boston were whatever, Presbyterians or Puritans or whatever they were at that point. So what do you think guided that middle way so that everyone was sort of unhappy, but it really served everyone probably better than any lesser or more specific reference to being Christian?
You want to take them both?
Yeah, or is there a third?
Oh, he's a Trinitarian. Yeah. But I think we're good with 2.
We're good? Okay.
A dualist.
I think with the last question, the men who came together at Philadelphia that summer in 1787 were trying to solve a problem, the problem that the Articles of Confederation weren't really working. So they were really interested in creating a national government that was going to be better, more stable, more enduring than what they had. And so they weren't essentially creating the Platonic ideal of a state. They were out of e pluribus unum, out of many one. That's what they were trying to do. And so a lot of the issues that would get in the way of that were issues that they shoved to the side, which is one of the problems of the Constitution, was something like how it dealt with slavery, which was it kind of kicked the can down the road, because to make an anti-slavery constitution meant you weren't going to get the slave states to get and a pro-slavery constitution explicitly, you wouldn't get the northern states. So a lot of this was based on compromise, and I think that they've realized Alexander Hamilton might have quipped, probably not. We had forgotten it, but the issue was it was going to get in the way, and it wasn't really what they were interested in. As far as this idea of interfaith commonality. 2 points. One, this is one of the things that Murray was concerned about, that Rome was essentially keeping Catholics from interfaith activity, and this meant this increased the suspicion of Catholics in American society. But the story that you mentioned in the Dorchester is interesting because, and maybe this is a good place to end. So I used to be a tour guide in Washington, D.C., back in the day, and I gave, any of you take like the bus around the mall and like see the monuments and stuff? I would narrate the monuments, and many of them have this very strong religious dimension, right? You go to the Lincoln Memorial, and it's a shrine, it's a temple to democracy. Now, sometimes I would take a trip with students up to the National Cathedral, up on Wisconsin Avenue. And have you been to the National Cathedral? Okay, so you go to the National Cathedral and you walk in and you see the flags of all the country, all the states sort of hanging, and on the floor are the seals of all the states. And you look to your right and there's a big statue of George Washington, and behind him is a symbol, Masonic symbols. And you look to the left and there's a statue of Abraham Lincoln, and there's scenes of American history in stained glass windows. And you walk about halfway through the cathedral and you turn to your right and there's the War Chapel. And in the War Chapel, there are a number of stained glass windows, including one which I believe has a representation of the Dorchester, the chaplains who gave up their lifeboat to the sailors, and sort of in this act of sacrifice for the nation. There's a stained glass window. In the middle is a crucified Christ. Below him are the seals of the military services, the branches. Below that is a representation of a military ceremony, a military cemetery. And I think what it's trying to say is that there's some parallel between the sacrifice of Jesus and the sacrifice of the American military for the country. Now, this is a really powerful expression of, I think, Christian nationalism, right? It's also an expression of a kind of religious ecumenicism, right? If you continue on in the cathedral, there are kneelers in the St. James Chapel, and on the kneelers are names of many famous Americans, including presidents and inventors and religious people, religious leaders like John Winthrop and Roger Williams. And I say all this because National Cathedral is actually the seat of the Episcopal Church, of the Episcopal Diocese in Washington, D.C. It's the Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul. It is a particularly denominational space, but it represents itself as a place of prayer for all people, right? As this capacious place of worship. I think that the building and what I've described in the building represents some of the tensions of religion and politics in America. I think for the people that I write about in this book, it's a heretical space, right? But it's a space that represents this balance of religion, religious symbols, religious expression, and the American political project.
And so I am going to close with reading just a few sentences from the end of the book. If it is to endure, America's liberal democracy will have to be sustained in the absence of a moral consensus or clear-cut spiritual foundations. And its citizens and others who dwell and sojourn within its borders will have to manage to live together with all of their profound and intractable differences. This requires an ongoing exercise in democratic virtue and liberality, not without tensions and temptations, sometimes happily, sometimes with ambivalence, frustration, and conflict, within the admittedly not entirely neutral frame of our liberal democratic republic. This is, in its own way, a serious moral project. Thank you, Jerome, for writing this book, and thank you all for coming.